Much for being here. Open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 4. I marked that we were going to start at verse 17. We are now working our way through the Christian Scriptures. We'll spend more time here than we did in the Hebrew Scriptures, at least part of the Hebrew Scriptures. As you all know, who've been through these studies before, the Jews put more emphasis on the first 5 scrolls of their scriptures rather than the last 34. The Torah, which means teachings or instructions, are the most important. Every year at the temple or congregation B'nai Emunah, they read through the Torah. If you were to go 52 Friday nights in a row, you would hear the Torah read. Then they have readings on Friday nights that's called Haftorah, H-A-F-T-O-R-A-H, Haftorah, additions to or supplements to. And I've got a commentary I bought at the Temple Israel bookstore on Haftorah, in which Haftorah readings are normally read to accompany the reading from the Torah. So they have found, usually from the prophets, they consider the prophets second, and then the so-called wisdom literature and history books and so on as being probably in third and in line of importance. So first comes the Torah, then come the books of prophets and prophecy, and so they give a lot of emphasis, as we do, to Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and some of the passages from the minor prophets, the 12 ones that don't have quite as much material in them. Okay, so we spent a good bit of time in the Torah, and then we moved more quickly through the other books, and now we're at the Christian Scriptures, and we're going to spend more time here. So we will begin after we pray. God, we have been moving through this 40-day period of Lent once more, and we are now at the culminating week where we remember the passion, the suffering of our Lord. But it begins on Sunday morning with a triumphant parade down the Mount of Olives into the walled city. We read, having seen, we can almost feel what it must have been like that Sunday morning as they made that walk down that hill toward the beautiful little Kidron Brook. Just on their right hand, a big olive press called a Gethsemane, where Jesus and the disciples would return on Thursday night and where he would be arrested. These events come so real to us now if we're reading from your all-important book, if we've been following our devotional guides day by day. We know we are so close now to Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and finally, Easter Sunday morning. So bless us, we pray, that we give our best attention, our clearest minds and most faithful of hearts to the reading of your word. In Christ's name, amen. Just a word about next Sunday. It will be Easter, of course, and here at Boston Avenue we have 3 services. Parking is not the problem that it was 31 years ago when I first came, and we had Fred Jones Ford on 3 sides of us. Some of you remember that. All of the property across Boston belonged to Fred Jones Ford. It's where they sold the new cars and had their main service department. Immediately north of us here, where Tulsa Community College now has property, was the old junior high school. By the time I arrived, it was no longer being used as a school, but it was being used as a pre-release center by the Department of Corrections. And so women and men were brought from the various institutions around the state when they were within 6 months of release, and they were taught how to pass driving tests and all sorts of things to try to get them ready to move back into society. Eventually the building required so much maintenance and upkeep that the state decided to tear it down, and Tulsa Community College managed to get that property. But between us and that property was a huge parts distribution building, as you recall. Fred Jones had gotten in early with the Ford Motor Company, and every part put on any Ford automobile or truck in this part of the state, Fred Jones got a cut, a part of the action, because he owned that big parts distribution building. And that building still functioned until 6 years ago, when we finally were able to buy it and take it down. All along Cincinnati, you remember the used cars. All the cars that had been traded in on new Fords and pickups, of course, were sold across Cincinnati. We had the parking lot right here on the south and the new interdispersal loop. It wasn't quite open when I arrived in August of 1980. It was very close, but not open yet. When we came from the parsonage, we had to go under the new about to be opened portion of Broken Arrow Expressway, come to 13th, and then down to the church. A few months later, the interdispersal loop and the end of the Broken Arrow Expressway opened, which had cut off a fair amount of our parking on the south side. So it was important to have 3 services and to try to move people in and out of the parking lot that we had. Parking's not the big problem now, but we have continued to offer 3 services on Easter Sunday, which means we need this class to move to Rose Chapel next Sunday. Dr. Kroll is working on getting a good teacher for you. He's had a couple of calls in to Phillips Theological School professors asking if one of them might teach, but he said this morning still had not had a final word that one or the other of them would be your teacher on Easter. But I hope those of you who usually come to Sunday school will come to Sunday school. You'll worship at 8 o'clock, 30 minutes earlier, or come to the 11 o'clock service and be a part of Sunday school in Rose Chapel at 9:30. 10 minutes earlier, 9:30. Okay, chapter 4, verse 18. This is right at the end of Jesus having been baptized and then being confronted by the Satan, the liar, in the desert down south of Jerusalem. Now he's heard that John has been arrested and thrown into the prison at Machaerus. We know that John will be beheaded by the hateful king, who is swept away by the dancing of his stepdaughter, Salome, and promises her anything she wants. She asks her mother, "What do I want?" "You want John's head," and John will be beheaded. That's what kings did. That's what many kings still do. And the reason we're having these wars now around the Mediterranean world of people who are seeing an opportunity in some cases to be freed from some of these dictatorial heads of state who sometimes ruled over them for 30 and 40 years, 30 for Mubarak and 40 years for Gaddafi and so on. That's what we're seeing, that others with the internet and with satellite are discovering that not everybody in the world lives under tyrants like that, and that perhaps there is hope that they don't have to either. Nonetheless, John and Jesus lived in the time of such tyrants, and when Jesus heard that John had been imprisoned at this point, arrested and imprisoned, he moved back north to Galilee, about 90 miles north to the beautiful lake, and made his new home at Capernaum, which is only about 15 miles or so east of his hometown of Nazareth. As he walked by the Sea of Galilee, remember this is a lake. Those of you who've been there, remember it's not salt water, it's fresh water. Its water comes from several huge springs that gush thousands of gallons of clear water out of the ground. That water comes from the snows that fall on the Mount Hermon range in Syria. Jewish guides sometimes joke, but they're not really joking when they say that all of their water is controlled by people who hate them. Their water comes into Israel from outside Israel. And so the snows that melt on the Mount Hermon range go underground and come springing up in Israel. The springs are in Israel, and the little rivulets become bigger and bigger and form the lake we call the Sea of Galilee. The lake is about 8 miles long, and it's about 5 miles wide. It's shaped sort of like a pear turned upside down, the bigger part at the top and the smaller part at the bottom, but roughly 8 miles by 5. When we got there 2 months ago, it was very foggy. It had some showers. You couldn't see across it, but we did have a couple of days where the sun came out, and you could see all the way to the other side. He saw 2 brothers, Simon, who is called Peter. Now, by the time Matthew is writing, he is known by that name. He wasn't known by that name when Jesus first saw him. According to the Scriptures, he was given that name by Jesus at Caesarea Philippi, one of those beautiful springs of water that help form the Jordan River that flows into this lake. It was up there where Jesus asked, "Who do the people think I am?" And you know the answers that were given. And finally, "Who do you think I am?" "You are the Messiah of God." Simon said that. Jesus said, "Then I'm going to call you the Rock." And in Greek, that's Petros. But Matthew is writing a long time after that, and he knows Simon will become Peter. So he mentions that. Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And you and I know they still catch many, many fish there, and we had opportunity to eat a fish they call a St. Peter's fish, and it looks a lot, to me, like a crappie here in Oklahoma. It's about that size and looks a lot like it and tastes a lot like it. It's a very mild and very white and beautiful fish, usually served whole in Israel, head and all. I told you when we went the very first time, our Jason had just finished the 4th grade, and we had told him, the year before, he and Trey and Gail and I had gone to Europe on one of those TWA getaway tours back in those days, and we had told the boys, we're going to be with 40 strangers, and the 4 of us, 40 people we've never seen in our lives, but we'll have to be nice. We'll eat whatever breakfast is and whatever dinner is, and we'll be nice. And we went to Israel the same. So we get to the lake and the restaurant that specializes in cooking this St. Peter's fish, and it came out whole, fried whole, head and tail sort of hanging off the edge of the plate. And we started eating, and I glanced over at Jason, and he was doing fine after he had put his napkin over the fish's head. Just couldn't bring himself to eat it with the eye looking at him. But anyway, these fellows were fishermen, and much of their catch was by nets. And Jesus said, "Follow me, I will make you fish for people." Or "I will make you fishermen of men." Now, the generic is used, men and women, people. Immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, his brother John, in the boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets, and he called them. And immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. I told you just last Sunday that Bishop William Willimon, bishop in Alabama, former dean of the chapel and the university at Duke, one of our Barton Clinton Gordy presenters, said that in his new book, Why Jesus?, many of his students at Duke wanted to know about miracles, so on. Do you really believe that, Dr. Williman? Do you really believe somebody could do that, did do that? And he said, I often said to them, those whom Jesus called didn't get to ask all those questions. He just walked up to folks and said, why don't you come and follow me? You're fishing for fish. I have something far bigger in mind for you. Why don't you come with me? And they went. And he said, I would say to the Duke students, why don't you try following him? And if you try following him, I believe he will reveal himself to you a step at a time, a day at a time, for the rest of your life. They followed him. The Gospels are unanimous in that. He called them and they followed. So Jesus went throughout Galilee. You recall that in his time, the land around the lake was called Galilee. The land down around Jerusalem was called Judea. Judah in the Hebrew Scriptures, now Judea, pronounced more in the Roman way. Judea in the south, and right between the two of them, Samaria. The mixed-blooded folk who had been sent to replace the 10 northern tribes when they were decimated 722 years before. Long, long time. And these mixed-blooded folks lived right there in between Galilee and Judea in the south. Jesus went throughout Galilee, the northern territory, teaching in their synagogues. We saw the one at Capernaum, and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. Chapter 5. Those of you who've been to Israel, remember a beautiful church up on the hill. Again, if you sort of envision a pear-shaped lake, Capernaum would sit right where the 12 would be if this were the face of a clock. And just above Capernaum, the hills begin, and if one goes up the first main hill there's a beautiful church. I listened carefully this time to see if Pilar would tell people who built that church. She didn't. You remember who did? Mussolini. Benito Mussolini built that church, and so they don't talk much about who built it these days. He was trying to curry favor with the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope, and he built them a church of the Beatitudes up on the hill just above Capernaum. Now, we don't know for sure that's where Jesus stood when he taught these many things that he had to say. Luke chooses to have that sermon. Luke's is a little bit shorter, but contains many of the same teachings that we have on the Sermon on the Mount here. Luke says it was on the plain, and when he came down onto the plain, Luke saw Jesus identifying much more with common people. He says as much. The common people heard him gladly. And I've told you in the very first one of these Beatitudes, you'll notice that Matthew says Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit. Luke, looking at the same material, we're sure, looking at the same material, said, blessed are the poor. Because that's where Luke's heart was. It was with the common people, and the common people were poor. Somewhere back there, some ancestor had lost their land, and they were now living day by day. Could they find work today? If so, the family ate. If there was no work, no eating. Luke writes to them and about them. So, anyway, Matthew, remember, is trying to convince a Jewish readership that they should believe Jesus was the Messiah for a number of reasons, but one of them being he was greater than Moses. And I went through that with you. Muslims believed the clearest revealer of God ever was Muhammad the prophet. Jews believed the clearest human revealer of God, not that God was present in him like we believe he was in Jesus, but the clearest human revealer of God ever was Moses. And so if one is going to convince Jews that Jesus is the Messiah, he has to be greater than Moses. And that's what Matthew is trying to do. So where did Moses see the burning bush? On the mountain. Where did he get the Ten Commandments? Back on the same mountain. So Jesus goes up the mountain and teaches. Other scholars say, though, that Matthew could have been right about where he taught, because as these hills form just immediately as you come out of the lake there, if you come out of the lake on the northernmost bank of it, the hills begin again. And so if people were sitting on that hillside, it would be a pretty natural amphitheater for one to speak to lots of people at one time. Whatever the setting, the words are the important thing, of course. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain. And after he sat down, and notice how important this is to Matthew too, the sitting down. I mean, you and I read that and think, well, it's because he's going to be a while. No, he did that because that's what teachers did. Teachers sat, students stood, as a rule. Gail and I went to the University of Tulsa to hear Dr. Elie Wiesel. Dr. Elie Wiesel, the famed Holocaust survivor, who has taught for years at our Boston University Seminary, our United Methodist Boston University Seminary, has written more than 40 books since he survived the Holocaust. That Dr. Elie Wiesel, and when he was introduced, he walked out onto stage and sat down. And he taught us sitting, though he could walk fine. He was the teacher, and we were the students, and we were supposed to listen, and we did. So you'll find here again that Jesus is called often teacher or good teacher. You know that rabbi simply means teacher, and so he was called rabbi, or he was called Rabboni, good teacher. So he sits as a teacher should. Sat down, and his disciples came to him. So already Matthew sees the people who are coming to hear, people who are already believing in him, because of all these wonderful things he's been doing that he just mentioned back there in the latter part of chapter 4. He's been doing lots of good things, and word has spread, and so those who believe, disciple means literally learner, so those who want to learn more about what he has to say, what he's doing, who he is, they've come. He sits, they listen. So he began to speak and taught them, saying. Now, the Sermon on the Mount is Matthew's attempt to show Jews Jesus is greater than Moses. So Jesus quotes many things that are found in Torah and says these are good. But there's something even more important than doing the law, and that's the intent of the law. So this is the part about, well, it says you shall not kill, and that's correct. You shall not commit murder, literally it says. You shall not commit murder. But I say to you, don't even scream, you fool, to your brother. You see, how does anger ratchet up until you have these horrible crimes being committed? Don't do the first thing that leads to the ultimate thing. Jesus is the one, Matthew understands, who not only understands Torah and does Torah in his own life, but he understands the intent of every part of Torah. So listen as we go here. All right, here again Matthew believes Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This past fall, our Jewish Christian Dialogue group was reading a book called A Rabbi Talks to Jesus. This rabbi lives in Florida. He is a professor at one of the universities in Florida. It's not a Jewish university, it's a state university, but they have a chair in Jewish studies, and he occupies that chair. He has written more than 150 books. I mean, it's unbelievable. He turns out 4 or 5 a year. It's amazing. But this one was called A Rabbi Talks with Jesus, and it received such wide hearing that Pope Benedict XVI read the book and wrote a response to it. And there's a smaller book out where he responds to the rabbi, thanking him, first of all, for what he's done, what he's tried to do, and then, it's sort of a rebuttal to what the rabbi says. But what interested me was that the Jews in our group, who were very special to me, but they said, Jesus here is not being a good Jew with a couple of things. They didn't like the part about being poor in spirit at all. And they didn't like verse 5, which is about being meek at all. And they said, that's not who Jews are. And what they took that to mean was that from other teachings as well, if somebody strikes you on the cheek, turn the other also. No. And what they say is, we tried that way in Germany in 1934, and 6.5 million of us died. So that was not the right way. And they're very clear. The right way is, if you hit me, I will hit you harder. Since we were in Israel, they had one bombing. They had not had any suicide bombing since the wall went up, separating Israel from parts of the West Bank. None in 10 years. And then just a few weeks ago, a little travel bag was left by a bus. The very same bus station where it was our women mostly, some of the women in our group who had decided they couldn't live another day without going to a big shopping mall. And so at night, when smart ones of us were asleep, they got on the bus and went to a big mall. It was at that bus station that someone left, a little travel case, like a gym bag almost. And then got safely away, and with radio controls detonated it, and a couple of people were killed. So the next night, jets from the Israeli Air Force were strafing known Hamas targets in Gaza. And then just last week, a rocket was launched from inside the Gaza Strip and hit a bus, and 2 more Israelis were killed. And that night, after dark, the Israeli jets were strafing known Hamas houses in Gaza. So they were saying, Tulsa Jews were saying too, forget this business about poor in spirit. Forget this business about meek. No, sir, you hit me, I'm going to hit you harder. Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn, they will be comforted. And let me stop a second. And some of you have heard me do funerals occasionally, not every time by any means. I talk about the word comfort because I think the word comfort has changed meaning a lot. And from the Greek word that Jesus is using, I think it has. In the 23rd Psalm, when the poet talks about rod and staff comforting me, I think that's much closer if you really stop and think about what's being said. When we use the word comfortable, we usually mean, a Saturday afternoon, Sunday afternoon when you have nothing to do but stretch out on your couch with your favorite chip and dip and turn the golf match on, and as they whisper to you, you go to sleep. That's not what comfort meant at all. Those of you who studied Latin with me know that comfort comes from Latin. C-O-M is the Latin word C-U-M, with. As in compassion, I talked about last Sunday. Cumpate in Latin. Cumpate, to suffer with. Compassion means literally to suffer with. Okay, cum fortes in Latin. Fortes, we have in English, fort. Fortitude. Comes from the same root. It has more to do with strength and power than soft pillows and chip and dip. Notice in the 23rd Psalm, yea, though I walk through, and it literally says in Hebrew, valleys dark as death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod, walking stick. A walking stick that could also be used to flail away at predators, wolves that threaten the sheep, and staff, a long and crooked one, for pulling the little sheep closer to you with one hand and flailing away at the enemy with the other. Staff and rod and staff, they comfort me. See, that's not a soft pillow. That's not, thin screen, high definition television. If you go down in that dark valley's dark as death, you need that great shepherd who's got a club in one hand and a crooked stick in the other, pulling you closer, and flailing away at your every enemy, and that comforts me, the poet said. See, it's a wonderful word, but it has, when we come to funeral times, no one who knew and loved the deceased is feeling comfortable if it means you have no worries, no thoughts, no troubles, no anxiety about what comes next. No, but if you mean comfort and strength, we can know that. We can know strength of having the Lord as our shepherd. Okay, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Hear the word meek. I tried to say this to some of our Jewish friends, because Greek is not their language. Hebrew is their language. This was written in Greek by Matthew, though Jesus spoke Aramaic, so it's already gone through one translation before it gets to you and me, and then into English is another. But the word meek in Greek, the one that's translated here as meek, is more about, it's sometimes used for a horse that's been taught to respond to a bridle. The meek are those who've been reined in, if you would, broken for riding or plowing or useful service. The meek are those who are being guided and directed by the one who created, and so on. I think that's a better rendering. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And here again, righteousness, it'll help you to remember right standing. Who hunger and thirst more than anything for right standing. And we stand right with God only one way, according to our Christian faith, and that is we trust that the one who breathed into us the breath of life loves us as much as any other creature on the planet. Not more than, but just as much as any other. Loves all His children the same, every one of them, and wants good to come to every one of them. That you trust God is not the enemy. God is the friend. God is the Creator who wants only good to come to you and grieves with you when things bad are coming to you. When you want that more than anything, the assurance that God Almighty cares about you and you trust that that is so, then you have right standing. God's gift, right standing. And we stand right with each other when we're doing agape. But boy, agape is not an easy thing. To put yourself out for the well-being of another. Gail and I, in our age, have become experts on parenting. We are experts. And so when we're out eating or whatever, and we see what some parents are doing at that table, over at that table, who've decided somehow that the only way one loves a child is to say yes. And that we have these many, many children running around the planet who've never heard the word no. No. Seeking the well-being of the other is not always saying yes. We had 10 men living under this bridge right down here again 2 weeks ago. Living there, not just a night. Had moved in under the bridge. And our Paul Stott contacted John 3:16 in the Day Center for the Homeless and the Salvation Army and the Tulsa Mental Health Association. And each one supplied one, and they had an intervention. They went together under the bridge and confronted these 10 men and said, this is not the way for human beings in Tulsa, Oklahoma to live. There's a better way. And the police have told us we can put up these eviction notices, and if you do not let us help you, the police are going to come and remove you. But we have places that you can go and sleep safely, out of the weather, and places you can eat, and we're here to tell you what they are. And Paul said the intervention went wonderfully well, and all 10 have been moved to acceptable housing. You know the family that's doing more than any other single family in this area on this regard? The Zaras again. Mr. Henry Zara and the next generation of Zaras, Judy Kushner and the others, they are putting up the big money to help build these houses, apartments for people who are mentally ill or destitute, need to be off the street. So, right standing with others is not always saying, you can sleep under the bridge by our church. No, there's a better place than sleeping under the bridge. You can't sleep under the bridge and make your home here, but we're going to show you a better way. We're going to tell you about the better way. We're going to help you get to the better way. Okay. So to hunger and thirst to stand right with God and to stand right with others, neither of those is easy for us. Blessed are the merciful, they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. And that was happening far more in Matthew's day than in Jesus' day. The disciples who had moved into Gentile areas now, where they were a small band against a much bigger number of people who were worshiping false pagan gods, whose whole economy centered around these false pagan gods. The meat sold in the markets had first been offered to pagan gods. The silversmiths and the goldsmiths, people who were making things out of wood, they were making them as replicas of little gods and goddesses. And when Christians came into that community, or people who lived in that community became Christian, they were often reviled and persecuted. So that was happening some in Jesus' day. It was happening much more in Matthew's day. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And then we love this next part. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. I think all of that's very understandable. I remember one of my professors talking about this light that gives light to all that are in the room. In the house, it literally says in the house. Have you seen those little lamps that they used in Jesus' day? You can see them in the museums in Israel. They're tiny little things, about that big around, made out of clay, and had a little bit of olive oil and a little wick. And that gives light to all that are in the house. What does that tell you? It was a little bitty house. It was a little bitty house. Many of them, one room. One room. That's all they had. If you had 6 kids, it was mom and dad and 6 kids in one room. That's the way they lived. The poor. Now, hear these words, because Matthew, he and Luke are searching through this quella, through the source that they had available to them that contained the teachings of Jesus. Mark doesn't give you many of the teachings. Mark is what did he do next and what happened. Matthew and Luke give you far more of the teaching material. And they're looking for things. Matthew chooses some that support his way of understanding the gospel. And Luke chooses others to support his. It's like doing a research paper. And we can write on the same subject, maybe even read the same books, and you come up with a term paper that sees things using this material, and somebody else writes a term paper on the same subject, and it may be equally as good as the other, but choosing material differently. I've told you, my senior 12th grade in high school literature teacher, Ms. Lila-Belle Legrone, taught me how to write a term paper, how to start with this much material and move to this much and this much and this much and write an outline and write the paper. And Monday I start here, and Tuesday I'm here, and Wednesday I'm here, and Thursday I write an outline, and Friday I'm looking for illustrations. That's the way I do a sermon every week. Okay, but another minister who's equally committed to preaching the lectionary, who's going to preach from the same text I am, who may be reading the same commentaries I read, is going to come up with a very different sermon. You understand? And the Gospels are more like sermons. Matthew's sermon and Mark's sermon and Luke's sermon and John's sermon. And so Matthew is looking for teachings of Jesus that support the argument he's trying to make. It doesn't mean he made this stuff up. It simply means he was looking for things in the teaching of Jesus that would support what he believed the gospel to be for the audience to whom he's writing. So you can see that if he's trying to convince Jews that Jesus is their Messiah, not just the Gentiles' Messiah, then these next few verses would have been very important. Do not think I've come to abolish the Torah or the prophets. I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the Torah until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds, not falls short of, that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And the scribes and Pharisees were zealous keepers of the Torah. And so when Jesus says your righteousness has to exceed theirs, he doesn't mean you don't do what they're doing. What they're doing generally is right. But what is the intent behind each of the commandments? As I mentioned before, the thing about adultery, for example, one of the 10 commandments, you shall not commit adultery. Jesus said, don't even lust after a woman in your own heart. Dr. Charlie Shedd, famed Presbyterian preacher who was in Houston when I was right out of seminary. He was pastoring Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church, and I was the associate at Memorial Drive Methodist. I was reading Charlie's books. They were really good, particularly about marriage and family. Charlie really helped me one night when he agreed, after speaking at our church, to go into the coffee shop right across the street and help me. I was talking to him primarily about how he managed his calendar and so on, but he We sat there till after midnight with Charlie Shedd, helping me understand. In his he first wrote to his daughter, Karen. Karen was the oldest. She was getting married. And so he wrote letters to Karen on keeping love in marriage. Didn't start out to write a book. He was just writing letters to his daughter, who was a senior in college, planning to get married the next summer. And he just started writing and saying, your mother and I have discovered, whatever little bit of advice he was giving. And Karen finally said, Daddy, I've saved every letter, and they're absolutely wonderful. I wish every young woman could read my letters. And they agreed together that they would publish them, letters to Karen on keeping love in marriage. So then when Peter got to be a senior in college, or maybe a couple of years after that, and was ready to get married, said, hey, Dad, how about advice for the guys? And he wrote promises to Peter. Promises that he and Martha had made about how they would try to raise this son of theirs who had come into their lives. And one of the things I remember his telling in that book was, Peter, you're so excited and so much in love with, I don't remember what her name was, the young lady to whom he was engaged. And right now you think you will never, ever look at another woman in your life. But let me tell you something. A few months from now, one day you'll be walking down the main street of Houston, and some young lady will walk past you with long legs and a really nicely shaped body, and you will find yourself turning and following her with your eyes. That's not the end of the world, he said. But what it should do for you is say, gee, I wish I could go home right now and see my wife. And then he said, you cannot keep the birds from flying over your head. You can keep them from nesting in your hair. That's what Jesus was trying to say. Yeah. That's what Jesus was trying to say. So the way the Sermon on the Mount is presented is that the Torah was right. Do not commit adultery. It will really tear up your community if you're not being faithful to your spouse. You're sleeping with somebody else's spouse. It will tear up your community. But Jesus is saying, but before adultery ever takes place, there are things that you're doing that are going to lead you into trouble. Nobody ever starts out saying, I think I'll go commit adultery this afternoon. You give in a little and a little and a little more, and then the terrible thing begins to happen. Okay. Here's an example. Let's go on, read a little bit more here. You've heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. You'll see that in our New Revised Standard Version, it translates that commandment about killing to committing murder. The Jews understood that when people attack you, you have every right to defend yourself and so on. I mean, there are reasons why sometimes people have to kill other people. But murder, we understand that's a very different thing. And so here, murder is the word that's used. Whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with your brother or sister, you'll be liable for judgment. If then you insult a brother or sister, you shall be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. And the hell of fire here, you'll see, has a little letter by it because it translates the word Gehenna, which was specifically a little valley that still is there, runs right along the western side of the old walled city. On the eastern side, you have the beautiful little Kidron Brook and the Mount of Olives, but on the other side, we know that when King David took Mount Zion from the Jebusites to begin a new capital city, the Jebusites had been offering human sacrifice in the Hinnom Valley. And that word became in Greek Gehenna, and when the Jews took this land, David and others, that was the worst of places where humans had been sacrificed. And so they decided, well, that's a good place to make the city dump the garbage. Put the garbage in the valley of Hinnom. And as the city grew, they set fire to it, and it got to the point More garbage, just kept the fire going all the time, day and night, burned all the time. And so that's the word that's used here. You can end up, in that miserable place where not even your own relatives will claim your body. They just toss it on the city dump because you've made such tragic mistakes here. You don't have to murder somebody. This road rage that so many people lend themselves to, that gets so out of hand so quickly, you have to watch anger very, very carefully. So when you're offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you'll never get out until you've paid the last penny. This was debtor's prison. Again, he's not talking about people who've committed rape and murder. They had very severe penalties for them. Poor people are the ones who are put in jail. Couldn't pay their debts. So try to settle on the way to court. Say, please, let me work for you, whatever. Try to work this out, because once they put you in, they're not going to let you out till you pay the last penny, and you don't have a penny. That's the point. It's very good advice. And there's the part about adultery that we've already dealt with enough, I think. Look at verse 38. Skip down verse 38. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And you and I think that's terribly harsh. But in fact, eye for eye and tooth for tooth were very fair. The Jews had brought their community far beyond what most people were doing, because before this eye for eye, tooth for a tooth, it was you knock out a tooth and somebody else knocks out an eye. Or we say sometimes a person was put in jail. Well, our little Abigail recently went to see, she goes to Jinx, but she had a friend who goes to Cassia Hall, and Cassia Hall Drama Department was doing Les Miserables. Abby had never seen Les Miserables, but in one of her classes, she had just had to read Les Miserables, and her teacher said, if any of you can go see the performance at Cassia Hall, this would be a good thing. And she went. So at lunch last Sunday, we were talking about Les Miserables, and I said, Abby, isn't it scary that a man can be put in prison for years for stealing a loaf of bread when his family's starving to death? Yeah, that's really, really sad that can happen. So when the Jews said, no, you don't get 20 years for stealing a loaf of bread, it should be an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. What's fair, not what's unfair. But Jesus said, that's a good thing. I mean, as far as it goes, don't punish one more than one has been punished. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go the second. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who comes to borrow from you. And again, he's dealing with a society where so many people were living on the very margins. I mean, no work today, no food for you and your family. None. It was so important. They didn't have the government agencies to help out that we have today. No. The Romans provided nothing like that for Jews. Nothing in Jesus' time. And so if your neighbor doesn't have work and the family next door to you is going to go to bed without any food when they wanted to work and there was none available, you be sure to help them. And we have a lot of social service agencies now that try to help do that. We have sufficient places right now, particularly with the expansion of John 3:16, that every homeless person in Tulsa can have a safe, clean place to sleep on a cold night. Everyone. And we have agencies in the downtown of our city that everyone can eat 3 meals a day. Everyone. And churches like ours are glad to help point the way to these agencies to which we all contribute. Okay. Let me go on with a little bit farther here at verse 43, because I think there's something important for you to see. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven, meaning you will act like the one that created you. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even tax collectors do that? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even Gentiles do that? So to whom is Matthew writing, and to whom is Jesus speaking? Jews, their people. And Gentiles were considered sort of the trash of the world. I mean, the Greeks, if you weren't one of them, you were a barbarian. And to Jews, if you weren't one of them, you were a goyim. You were a goyim. You were the ethnos. You were the Gentiles. And they do anything, was the attitude, so to speak. And so here Matthew says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And I can assure you, Jews think they can do that. They think they can do that because the Jews are not working off of Greek philosophy. But Gentiles are. By and large, the Western world has taken our thought from the Greeks through the Roman Empire and into our modern-day societies. That's why we were taught the history of Western civilization. And so when we studied Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, these three had a three-storied universe, if you recall. The level where we live, the level down below where the dead are, and the level above. And only in the level above is there perfection. And those of you who've read those three great philosophers know that they talked about a chair. There is no perfect chair. The legs are too tall for some and too short for others. And there's a bar on the back that hits some too high and some too low. And the chair is too soft for some and too hard for others, and so on and on. So we keep working on building a better chair, but ultimately the only perfect chair is up there. And down here we merely have humans' best efforts to get as close to the perfect chair as we can. So for anybody trained in classical Greek philosophy, this verse blows their mind. And it still does. People say, perfect. Yeah, right. For Jews, this was not a problem. God acts this way, you act like God. Okay. And Matthew writes it that way. Luke is a Gentile himself. And he's writing to Gentiles. And he gets to this same thing, probably in the Quella, and he says, oh my goodness, these Gentiles are never going to get this. And so he comes right down, he's copying word for word like Matthew, and he gets to this little verse and says, so be ye merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. Okay, the Wesleys said, hey, if Jesus said this, then we must be able to do this perfect business. And so they set out to show that in this lifetime one can become perfect by the grace of God. And the Wesleys have a long argument. John, one of his standard 44 sermons that he preached all over England, Scotland, and Ireland, in those 44 sermons that he could wake up at 3 in the morning and do one, still sitting on horseback if he needed to, one of them is about perfection. And he says, in this lifetime, we will never be perfect in action. Not in our acts. We will always be less than perfect. So, Jesus must have been talking about something else. And Wesley says, we can become perfect in our wills. in what we want to do. God can bring us to that point. If we walk closely enough to God, if we do what Jesus says in John's Gospel, we abide in Him and beg Him to abide in us, we can get to the point that we want only faith in God and agape love for the other. And though we Methodists do not canonize, we don't make people into saints. If we were to do that, we could pick out some, and some of those would be like Mother Teresa, as she's depicted for us. Mother Teresa was a Roman Catholic nun who had been sent to India to teach British children of affluence. British people who had stayed on in India, even after India was granted independence from England. But there were a lot of English business people who continued to do business from within India, and she taught at a Roman Catholic school for these girls of privilege. And one weekend, she had off from her duties and responsibilities. She walked through the poorest neighborhoods in Calcutta. And she saw the sick and dying lying everywhere. And she prayed and prayed and then asked permission to leave the convent where she was a teacher to spend the rest of her life on the streets of Calcutta. And when people ask, do you really think you can make a difference in a city of squalor of 15 million people? And she said, no. No, I don't think I can impact 15 million. But I can give this one a drink of water. And I can bathe this one's fevered brow. And I can hold this one's hand while she dies. And we think she got about as close to what God had in mind as a person could be. And the Wesleys believe that you and I can be brought to that point where we may not always do the right thing, but our heart is right. We want the right thing. And so often, after I bring the prayers in here just before the service begins, and I move to the altar myself, I have a very brief prayer before I rush downstairs to pray with the choir. And often what I've come to say, it's become a habit now, but it's no less sincere, oh God, help me to will and to do your will. Sometimes I add, oh God, help me to seek and know and will and do your will. And I think that's what Jesus had in mind. All right. Well, we're going to have to stop there. I got 4 people I need to baptize in this next service. I need to go see if they've come to the library to meet me. So don't rush off if you haven't been to church. I'll be right back. I'm going to mark down. And the next Sunday's Easter, and you'll be in Rose Chapel. And then on the 30th, is that right? No, May the 1st. May the 1st will be the next Sunday. May 1st, I'll be right back with you. And